This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with Olympic Canoe Slalom Coach at British Canoeing, Craig Morris. He discusses his constraint-led approach and how this benefits the athletes, his work in empowering his athletes and how this benefits them on race days, as well as some of the challenges faced by Olympic athletes. Oh, and why you're here. Why not do us a favour by subscribing and sharing this podcast with a friend? Thanks in advance, and I hope you enjoy. Perfect. So, Craig, listen, really appreciate you making a bit of time for me. I know that you've got a lot on, and really thankful that you've been able to make a bit of space. How are things your end? All okay?
Yeah, fine. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's great to be here. Nice to press pause and have some time for reflection and learning with you.
Perfect. So for me, this is a really good opportunity just to learn a little bit more around a sport that maybe haven't got a lot of understanding of, and maybe just some learnings that can be carried across, I guess, mainstream into sports that I'm more familiar with. So for people that don't know you and don't know your background, can you just kind of give us a bit of an insight to what your role is and what that means from kind of a day-to-day, week-to-week basis?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Craig Morris, born in the Black Country in the West Midlands, and brought up kicking and screaming as someone who didn't like taking part in canoeing on Dudley's finest canal networks. And if we fast forward more years than I care to mention to now, the fact that I'm employed in performance sport or high performance sport in that discipline is quite ironic. Sure, my dad thinks it's ironic anyway. Maybe a bit of I told you so. But yeah, so I started canoeing at a young age, Michael, like 5. As a defiant youngster, really, because my brother was 5 years older and was well into the sport. And the long and short of it, really didn't find my own sort of sense of purpose and clarity and selfishness almost to pursue it in my own paddling career to really make sense of that, and fell into coaching, or was dragged into coaching just as an opportunity while I was a bit lost coming out of university. And here we are, probably best part of 16, 17 years later. My journey of coaching in the sport has really taken me, really fortunately, from beginners and voluntary work right through to working at the Olympic Games.
Perfect. So I think the first question, which is really good to set the scene, is what's the pathway for an individual that's got interest in canoeing and potentially wants to end up as a member of the team that you currently coach?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area to probe into. I think it's changed dramatically in the last 20 years as well. So when I was a youngster, really, canoeing was an extension of enjoying travel, I think. And we used to do a lot of caravanning, and we loved the outdoors. And, whether it was in the mountains or on the river, we were just there and having fun. And a lot of people kind of galvanized this sort of family social network around that. And the club network was quite strong at that stage, the local club network. Even in the flat water on the canal network of the Midlands, it was pretty strong comparative to what it is now. So the network was very much clubs, national governing bodies supported clubs to a degree with the funding they had at the time. Now, I think the picture looks extremely different, and we're probably in a bit of a state of change. There came a time where canoeing participation hit quite a low. And the club network was struggling for numbers, struggling for volunteers to support it. And therefore, as a governing body, we kind of took it on us to I guess, try and secure development a little bit as best as we could. So people would actually come from beginning, their first experience of beginning in a boat would be part of a program tryout, talent identification, if you will. Through to then going on to pathways, and then maybe even haven't. I find it really strange, but the youngsters of today, who are now some of their top boats, have probably hardly ever, if ever, paddled on a natural river. So we might say they're spoiled, but we wouldn't do that publicly, obviously. Pathways changed. We are obviously mindful of the vulnerability of that thin blue line of development in our sport. So we are looking at ways to expand. And the legacy of London was strong in terms of bringing people into the sport and trying to bolster club networks again. But essentially the kind of performance end of their sport is based around a few key centers at the elite level anyway, high performance senior level. And the club network is an area for us to really focus on still, I think, and try and galvanize. I think the challenge, as with many sports these days, is getting that balance of that like socio-cultural network within the sport. I think that's probably been the most hit in the time that I've seen as it's transcended my career.
Where are those kind of elite centres based, if you like? Where are they dotted around?
So within England, we have 2 or 3. The main one for a high performance senior program is where I'm talking to you from now. That's in Lee Valley, which is just outside the M25, North London. And that's where the Olympic Games was in 2012. Where we've all moved from at some point in our life, pretty much, is Nottingham, home Pierpont. So the Performance Centre there, I think, opened in 1985 and was the real sort of hotbed for canoeing for many of us. I went to university there to pursue my own canoeing. And there are some satellite centres around as well. There's one in Teesside, one in Cardiff, one in Pinxton in Scotland and Glasgow. I think once you get to a certain level, kind of the facilities and the access to peer learning and coaching at the highest level kind of sees generally most people navigate to London these days. But we are trying to obviously keep that sort of geographical satellite centre a real thing that can nurture people and development.
Having that broad net to start off with, just giving people an opportunity to almost find the sport, and then, as you said, if it's highlighted that they have a particular interest and maybe some particular talent in the area, then they've got that pathway. I guess what it does lend its next question to is, what are some of the key characteristics for someone who does well in the sport? So obviously you look at basketball, you go like LeBron James, Michael Jordan, football, rugby, they have a thing. For a paddler, is there anything in particular that you can kind of hang your hat on and say, this is a particular skill or physical attribute that helps them to find some level of success at the sport?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of variability, and we might get onto my views on sort of motor learning and things like that. Just as a snippet, we've seen Olympic medalists in our sport with a height and weight range, that would be very significant from a physical perspective. So, one of our best paddlers over the years was 62 kilos and about 5'7", 5'8". But equally, you'll have guys pushing towards 90 kilos and over 6 foot. And similar on the female side, obviously different ranges, but there's no one way, I guess. There's no one type. One thing that is important, I would say, is in order to be fluid and fast on a big whitewater course, then staying light on top of the water is important. Therefore, power to weight, in however you achieve that from an individual perspective, is the key characteristic. I think that most slalom coaches would kind of agree that is important. How you achieve that, obviously, it is very individual, whether it's from the strength side or from the body weight side, or a combination of everything, and how you use it through your skill on the water. But in the run itself, I think adaptability, it's changed over the years. It used to be a very aerobic sport. It's now a very power-based re-acceleration anaerobic sport, but it doesn't last long enough. It's around 100 seconds tops at its max, so it's not super long to be too anaerobic. But yeah, the power to weight re-acceleration element is huge. Courses have become more complex and shorter as the sport has grown, and the boats have accommodated that by becoming shorter and more maneuverable. But yeah, adaptability and decision making as sort of skill-based perceptual characteristics are really important for us. And yeah, if you're pretty ballsy, if I may use such a word, on the whitewater, that always helps, because I think you pay attention to fewer information sources. That gives you more adaptability in the run to be fast.
And for you guys, who obviously you're looking around, looking at the sport, how do you identify that kind of lightness on the water itself, or that power acceleration? How do you actually view someone's run and go, that's a characteristic they have, or something that actually with a little bit of tweak in here or there, we think that they'd be high potential in that area?
Try and answer a big question there with a short one. I think just dwelling within it, really. So, I certainly as a coach like to spend a lot of time observing and really dwelling in the situation, and a variety of situations. So within our sport, to give a bit of context, each venue is very different. Each course is different. So there's no sort of gold medal course or track or time. And there's no world record time because every course is different and every venue is different. And even if you imagine a riverbed as a kind of Lego block set, we can move the Lego blocks to change the river completely as well. So with that in mind, dwelling within and seeing individuals operate in a variety of contexts and how they adapt to those contexts is really critical. So you might, from a viewpoint more removed, be able to observe people who are perceived to be better on more flat water venues. They have excellent speed, maybe they're really good physically, but perhaps they struggle to adapt to the skill set when the river is big, like it is here in London. So really kind of taking time with individuals, and that's important to do at a development level as well, dwelling within the situations and exposing people to a variety of contexts to see how they adapt and how they take up with things, and then I guess co-create practice design that nurtures that and facilitates that. And then obviously you've got the sort of more land-based training and where that fits into that complexity and what it feeds for the opportunities to deliver skill and lightness on the water in the training run itself or the race run itself.
I guess looking at it from a training perspective, and I'm going to liken this a little bit to F1, just because I think that's a thing. Obviously, they break it into sectors, which allow you to figure out where people may be up or down within the part of the course, which I know you guys will do as well. But something, having spoken to a former driver on here previously, he'd mentioned is that the fluctuations between drivers from corner to corner and just kind of their natural style, and they'll go, well, I'll be down here because I know on the next one that allows me to put my foot down more and get through, etc. Is there that same variability for you guys in terms of when you're going through gates? Someone may be up by 100th of a second in this bit, but actually because of the way they've taken it, it slows them down for the next gate that they're coming to, or it's harder to maneuver? And how do you manage that whilst you're observing it? Because I imagine you could very easily go at the end and go, right, who's the quickest? Okay, they're the best. But actually, if you're planning for a particularly technical course out in Eastern European, for example, the way people navigate certain gates might allow them to have more success in that particular region.
Yeah, brilliant. I think what you invite me to lead on with there is there's a temptation in sport in the modern day of performance analysis, I think, to make the complex complicated, and therefore we're too quick to reduce it and to decontextualize the whole into the parts and assume that the parts will then add up to a whole. But that's not my experience of coaching and people's interaction with their environment. So I think whilst we do have an excellent analysis service that does break this down, it has been part of our journey of co-creating how we want to analyze and how much we bring in or how much we keep back. The skills are interlinked, they're in combination, because it's exactly what you talk about there in F1 is prevalent within canoe slalom. That if you reduce down things into manageable parts, you see a picture that isn't reality, because the parts are no longer interlinked, and therefore you can try and control the part, but you can't control how it transfers to the whole. And it's very much how I see skill. So how I see skill is very has a nice mirror to how I see the use of analysis, really. So yeah, obviously we keep our eyes open. There probably is a well-acknowledged thing as home advantage in our sport, in that the venues are so different. And it is a sport that when you want to dwell within, you need to spend a lot of time there. And because the courses are so different, the more time you spend there, the more courses you're exposed to. And therefore, the more experiences you have to learn where the invitations are to be fast in different ways, and watching the locals is very much part of everyone's, everyone hones in on a venue and probably analyzes the locals for a little bit. But again, it's not a copy and paste template, I think, which is maybe what your Formula One driver is talking about. It has to be contextual to the person interacting in the moment in that environment, and the car in their instance, or the paddle and the boat in our instance. Because I think a big part of our work is really a strength-based approach to coaching. And therefore, people have different strengths in different areas. And it's the aggregation of those strengths that kind of gives you a clearer picture. So we're often having to remind athletes that there's only one split that matters in the sport, and that is the total time. It's not the other 30 or 5 or 10 splits that the different nations might take along the way. The one that really matters, the highest order principle, is the total time. And how you achieve that is interesting, but really important that it's embedded within the whole when you look at it, I think.
This brings me really nicely to a question I think you may have, from my previous research, some opinions on, is kind of the skill acquisition side for an individual. So your sport is obviously going to be really big on trying to develop and hone particular skills to navigate the water as best they can. In your experience, or kind of from your perspective, how have you gone around teaching individuals skills? And what have you had the most success where it's allowed them to translate it from maybe a closed environment whilst you're practicing to then kind of in the heat of the moment when you're traveling however many miles an hour down, getting splashed in the face and stuff, they're able to translate it into that maybe chaotic environment?
Sure, yeah, you invite me to a very passionate topic, Michael, so thank you. You reminded me there, I do have an opinion, and I think a friend of mine tells a slightly rude joke where we all have opinions. But in reflecting to my early coaching years, I'm not sure I did have an opinion on what skill acquisition was, and that's interesting. So when I reflect back on it, I had a number of jolts that have led me to consider my early coaching years as what I would call a jigsaw coach. The picture of what I was trying to achieve with whoever it was in front of me was clear in my head. It was a very artistic view of canoe slalom. It looked very, very clear, and everyone could fit into that model. And by that, I mean the jigsaw picture was clear on the box, and the parts were over here, and the parts were the individual. And therefore, you're right, I did decompose skill down into technique, into very, what I would call impoverished or non-contextual parts. So we would do a lot of work on the flat water, on stroke biomechanics, for example, with a view that I believed it would magically, then when you put that jigsaw piece back into the hole, you would see this picture that was already there for you. And you just fill in, and you're colouring in between the lines effectively. Of course, 10 or so years of coaching later, that wasn't happening. People were quitting the sport because they weren't as engaged as I had assumed them to be. They weren't being treated as individuals, I don't think, in terms of how they relate to the skill sets or how they sort of self-organize around their own characteristics. And it really was a real jolt to me, really, to consider like what the sport actually was. And I would encourage any listener to actually take a step back and take some time and say, what is your sport? So for me, what is canoe slalom in terms of the race run, the game, the F1 race, whatever it might be? Like, what is your sport? What are the demands on the performer in the competition element of your sport? And how well does your practice methodologies align to that? And when you asked that question
to yourself, what is canoe slalom? What was the answer that you then got back, or what's the answer that currently you've ended up with, which has allowed you to have this viewpoint?
So it's an answer I've gone on a journey with colleagues both in and out of slalom, actually, because I love an independent opinion with no baggage. But where I've got to is what I would call becoming to have an understanding, because I don't believe I'll ever be there. So it's an evolution over time. But our sport is extremely dynamic and very much in a state of flux. Therefore, the key things are decision-making, intention, attention, decision-making, and action in a fluid environment, really. So we used to prepare for the event by setting a plan off the bank that we thought was viable. That was the jigsaw picture. Here's the run. Here's how it looks to be good on the run. Go and achieve that jigsaw piece. Put your pieces into that jigsaw puzzle. And how close you get when you come out the end will be your score. And that will be your place where you deserve to place. What I've come to learn through dialogue and co-creation with athletes and myself is that the view off the bank is a very conventional view, and it's influenced where I position myself in coaching. And it's very different to what is happening in the run. And decisions in the run can be very different in the moment, and the invitations for action that will give a good outcome can be very different to the conventional view that you would, in the position you would have liked to have been in the river. So elements that have got me to that point.
Have you got an example of how the context may change what the athlete maybe feels to what you see from the side?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a camera system here that is, I think football have it as well. It's kind of like an big overhead camera system. You're a GPS bib, etc. So, for example, when I'm down at river level, as I've said, it's really important for athletes to stay dry on top of the water to enhance their speed across the river and to be more in control of the water's perturbations. When you're down at river level, you see every little regression in speed. You see every little hit. You see the water break the buoyancy, break the face, and slow things down. When you go to that camera view up there, things look quicker, and you don't see these small perturbations in speed and things like that. So that's an extreme view of being really high to just on the bank. But if you take that to the view the athletes have down at ground level, everything looks really different. And therefore, if a coach is quite imposing of a plan or a prescribed technical routine on a course, I've become humble enough to know that that's from a viewpoint that they don't experience perceptually anyway. So it's largely irrelevant. And if you're imposing that upon them and they're taking that on board, then my experience is that they're likely to be paying attention to information that isn't important or specifying for their action in the run. They're effectively trying to recreate a movie from the bank that isn't their experience. And in my experience, it's either congested them mentally in that they've had too many information sources in there. And I've had people verbalize to me, I knew you'd hate that, or I was mindful I didn't achieve what you wanted me to achieve there, which was a big alarm jolt for me, because I've always positioned the athlete as the one doing, and that the sport is there. So that feedback was a big message that wasn't what I was achieving through my coaching. Or simply that they're just not seeing the invitations for action in the moment. Because water comes and goes for us. A wave is sometimes there, it's sometimes not there. So whether you use it with a particular blade or not is dependent on how you arrive at it and where you arrive at it from. Therefore, we want to be like higher order principles and more adaptable. So what you'll see from my early years of coaching and maybe other people is that the more prescribed you are, I think the more narrow your bandwidth for a performance is. So people freeze on the course if they're not on a particular blade that they said they wanted to be on. For example, if they don't arrive at that corner in F1 on the line or the camber they wanted to, they freeze. And of course, that further augments time losses down the course, really, and often just can freak people out mentally. And so they're very confined to a narrow bandwidth of performance, i.e. they'll perform if the stars align and the river is in harmony with them. I guess that doesn't happen very often in my experience. And the best in the world, from my observations, are really adaptable and really dynamic to the environment in front of them.
I think the cornering one's a really interesting one. I think if everyone can liken it, it's just driving their car. You might be driving your car around a corner and be expecting to go to a certain thing. All of a sudden, you see a puddle of water on the corner, or maybe an animal, or whatever, and you have to divert. Whereas if you stick to that plan, it's going to cause an accident or whatever. Whereas actually, if you're able to adapt and move where you go on the corner, then obviously you're able to keep going. I liken it from what you're saying there, kind of in a way similar to that. My next question off the back of that is, how do you support them to, one, be comfortable with that, and two, kind of learn that adaptability, decision making in the moment mindset? Because I imagine, one, it's at times maybe not the most common view. I'd imagine they probably have had experiences of coaches are going prescriptive of, this is the line you need to take, this is the type of blade you need to use, this is the body shape you need to be in. That's going to be a hell of a shift for them if they've come from that to what you're asking them to do, which is basically tell me how you feel, and then we'll work with how you feel on the course to maybe come up with some strategies that allow you to navigate the course in an effective way for you.
Yeah. So it's really clear or really important to me, should I say, Michael, at this stage, to say I used to coach like that. And it's still hard work to not coach like that at times as well. So it's really clear to be openly vulnerable here. This is my journey. This is what I've been curious to explore and what's kind of worked for me over the years. I'm not prescribing it on anyone else, but I invite them to explore it. I chatted with an athlete this week who has come on that journey with me. So that's an important part. Like, some learning from my early forays into nonlinear approach or constraints-led approach told me that I need to communicate my why to the athletes as well, and to take them on a journey. And I don't mean drag them on a journey, but invite them on a journey to explore my own learning and curiosities as much as we ask that from the athletes. So they're as aware on what I'm working on as I am aware on what they're working on. But the athlete, the quote was, letting go of control was terrifying, but it's been really enriching over the years. And by that, they mean that they have moved from a position of pure repetition. It's not quite possible in our sport. It's probably not possible at all. But in terms of wanting to control, I won't name them, but their mantra was, I want to do things till I can't get them wrong. So a lot of repetition repeats on stable tasks, or more stable tasks in our sport, and very prescribed on blade work, etc. But not the most adaptable of athletes. And we've gone on a journey together, really, to discover, what else is out there? How do we become more adaptable to be more stable in our outcomes of performance in racing and training? So I think the important thing is to meet people where you're at, or where they're at, more importantly. Meet the athlete where they're at. They're the most important person, because they're the one doing the doing. They're the one in the interaction. So find out where they're at. Like I'm on a bit of a, I don't know whether it's a solo mission, but I invite anyone to come with, on a mission to kind of move pedagogy or methodologies of practice away from the domain of coaches and embrace it across those doing the performers, the athletes, the players as well, because I think we don't need to hold all the cards. It doesn't need to be an egotistical position of power from a coaching angle. I think we can go on a journey together as companions and learn together. And the athletes have certainly been the most powerful learning tool for me over the years. So meeting people where they're at and finding out what stretch is comfortable and what they're curious to explore, and moving with them rather than moving them to you, I think, and seeing where that takes you. So, I certainly, in my early years of taking on the athlete I've just been talking around, I was in the very sort of curious phase of switching from a more linear approach to a non-linear approach. But what I did do is spend a lot of time observing them do what I would call more linear practice, because I wanted to understand why they were doing that, what they were getting from that, because it's important to connect with the individual before I have any influence. If I just jump in, then I've got no relationship, and therefore it's going to unravel pretty quickly. So the level of stretch, seeing where people are at, communication across the two of you, and then some safe to fail experiments, I think, along the way. And so a balance of training rather than a complete flip to a very complex approach, I guess.
And in terms of practically within your session design or your session types, or the way you design, particular practice of a skill, how has that change affected the way you actually deliver in that aspect?
Hugely, I would say. Hugely. Firstly, at a level of awareness, I think. So little did I as I talked earlier, I had no clue or opinion on how I was coaching before, because I hadn't really studied learning, coaching, skill acquisition. Once I did, and I was aware of how I was practicing, and perhaps the lack of why behind how I did practice, I noticed the first thing was a realization that I was practicing a lot of non-linear approaches, but without any awareness of them. So we were doing constraints-based stuff. It's common in this sport to do that sort of stuff, but I had no awareness of it. And it wasn't underpinned by an understanding of any theory or anything like that. So the language changed to start. I think it became more about interactions, about the doing, rather than kind of prescription from coaching. So it was.
Give a live example, if possible.
Yeah, it would have been a lot more around. Shall we explore some different varieties here, or how else could that be done, rather than go and try that like this? Is there anything we've missed here? I would be moving gates around to add some variability. So rather than perhaps waiting until they'd done a section well and then moving on, I would just add some more complexity into a section and see if they could still achieve the same stable outcome through a variable start position, or almost invite the fact that some stable outcomes that they'd achieved, i.e. they were really good at going off a left blade for a particular jump over a big bit of white water. Try and engineer a situation with the gates where the left blade was no longer possible. So that if they did, for whatever reason, which happens in S-Sport, arrive without a left blade in the water, they'd had an experience that told them there were multiple solutions available here. And where that's led us really is maybe like, rather than jump off here on a left, land on a right, move there, it's more about what's the highest principle here? Well, it's about moving left to right across a feature. So we focus our attention on that. And I guess what you're asking here, the practice has been about learning to self-organize without having attention on every internal cue. And by internal cue, I mean a technical cue, i.e. where's my arm? Where's my body in relation to my boat? What tension have I got here and there? To a much more sort of environmentally holistic cueing system. With analogies and things like that. So we trust a lot more, but that's been important to say. That's been a passage of time, and is still a passage of time in terms of people experiencing that, and letting go can be a scary beast, I think.
This might be a challenging question. Has this led to any of your athletes having kind of unique styles? Because what I can imagine on this, if you look at it from again, using another sport here, cricket in perspective, you've got someone like Steve Smith out in Australia at the moment, who leaves the ball in the most unique way that
he's a fidget, isn't he? He's a fidget.
Yeah, he fidgets around. And that, if you went and had a cricket book that maybe I had when I was growing up in the 1990s, no cricket book would tell you to use that technique to leave a ball. And no one would say, when they're doing the Sky Sports analysis, this is a really good and effective way to do it. But actually, he's found a technique that is useful for him and the way that he plays as an individual. So I'd imagine and I could be wrong, but from what you're saying there, it seems like you could end up with athletes who have quite unique styles because they just come up with solutions that's right for them at that moment, or with their body type, or the way that they navigate a course.
Yeah, absolutely. Personal experience, Michael, and I'll be like really, really direct with this for a bit of impact, is I've tried to shoehorn people into a style, and it was very unsuccessful. Like, I banged my head up against a brick wall, trying to complete that jigsaw and have everyone look the same. And it didn't work. So the biggest change has been that flip to viewing what is good or what is quality as the outcome of the task. As you say, as the outcome, like Steve Smith's one of the highest, scoring run scorers in world cricket, etc. It works. It might not look like David Gower for those purists, but it works. So it's like what I call an end in mind approach. We focus on the outcome of the task and the stability of the outcome in the task, not one way of doing it, not consistency. I'm really clear with the definition difference between that and stability. And we work backwards from that, rather than the approach of the jigsaw, which is, I want it to look like this. I'll work on the component parts, put it into the system to look like that, and the outcome will look like this. And we'll all play like David Gower or leave like Jeffrey Boycott, whoever it might be. So yeah, of course you get uniqueness because you embrace it and you allow it to be explored. And that's, permissions is so important. Like, we have to be mindful of the perceived power, and I'm careful to use the word perceived, or the perceived position of power, and how poorly that can be used with coaching to suppress people's individuality and to suppress their expression and their uniqueness. And because we all want creative athletes, but yet I've been guilty of doing everything to suppress creativity over the years. And now, sort of 15, 16 years on, I'm trying to invite it at every opportunity. And and are really clear to affirm it at every opportunity as well. So yeah, uniqueness is key. I mean, everybody's unique. Somebody asked me in a university lecture the other week, do you train adaptability? And I said, well, it's happening whether you like it or not. So yes, we try and embrace training it because that's important, because people self-organize in really individual ways for various reasons, a multitude of reasons. So therefore, running with it makes sense to me now, rather than trying to suppress it and control it into a predetermined view of how it should look.
Okay, so I guess my next question off the back of that is, if an athlete's struggling with a particular technique or a particular turn or a particular gait style, for example, how do you then go around supporting them if they've tried a variety of different actions or ways, but they're still having challenges with it, and that might be their area for development, because for them to reach the top 10 or top 5, that is an outcome that ultimately they're losing a lot of time on, and they need to have greater levels of success. How do you go around supporting them develop in that area?
Sure. I mean, start with communication, first of all, try and understand their first person experience of it. And then from a practical perspective, I'm fortunate. I work with very few athletes and I'm full-time. So we have a really rich environment where we co-create a lot and the athletes lead a lot of the interactions. So I'll try and zoom out to a broader view a little bit. I think we would scale the task. So rather than decompose it, i.e. break it down into its parts, we would scale it. So we might scale it to be a less complex version of the task, but it would still hold the information in the environment that the task they're struggling with. So it would still take place, some key principles of representative information for me. It would still have water, it would still have poles, the gates that hang over the water. It would have consequence, i.e. you'd have an awareness of time gain or loss because it's within a broader sequence. And some other elements around that. But yeah, essentially we would scale the task and break down, or we'd move environment a little bit. So obviously the course itself is not just one level playing surface like a football field is. It's very different in each of its sections as you navigate the river. So you can kind of work on similar skills in different contexts. So that is something I might ask the athletes. So one session that I run quite regularly is we have a real clarity of intention of what someone wants to work on in a skills session. I'm invited then, because of time constraints, to set the environment, to create the environment. But what I'll do is I'll over-create the environment with a multitude of options. And then the athlete would paddle down that, have a look at some of the tasks available to them, and then opt into the ones they are most curious to explore. So in your context there, if they are struggling, they know they can scale it themselves with their own motivation and determination to do so. And so we'll work together on that. But yeah, scaling to a level that we're clear that the slice of the game or the slice of the race run still has information that is representative of the race. But it could be a really small, if someone's really struggling, we've scaled it to be a really small slice, but it still looks like canoe slalom. We're not sat on a Swiss ball in the gym trying to achieve the skill that we're struggling with on the water, if that makes sense, with the poles and the environment and the lights, etc.
I think that's really interesting around the overstimulating the environment, allowing them to then choose or explore what's appropriate for them at that time. I'm just thinking how you could maybe maneuver that into a football session, or into a rugby session, into a team sport. How do you overstimulate the environment and then say, right, this is the outcome we're looking for. What are we going to do? I think that's a really interesting principle, maybe something for me to think about moving forward, and kind of how
I can maybe expand on that a little bit, if I may. So it might, hopefully be useful for someone. So I think in your early coaching, certainly in coach development, it was true for me. You really push to have a session plan for every session, and you push to have written reflections or verbal reflections from every interaction. I wouldn't say I never session plan, or I don't have certainly a written down plan these days at all. So, but I think some critiques of a more ecological approach to coaching, which is what I lean into, might assume that it's just chaotic and people just go and do what they like. I always say I'm meticulously planned to to enable being extremely fluid in the interaction. So in that example there, I've used a really deep understanding of the athlete's intentions and motivations to practice and where they want to evolve this skill and what they're curious to explore, to meticulously plan an environment or create an environment that I believe invites opportunities to explore it. But I'm not set with where they go within it. So what I'm trying to do by overstimulating is have enough routes. If we think about like going off on a hike in the mountains, have enough routes available towards a direction of travel, which might be the peak of the mountain, that if they want to go and explore the snow ridge, they explore the snow ridge because they're determined to do so. Equally, if they want to drop down the mountain and traverse out of the wind and outside the snow line, because that's where they're at today, because, you know, they've had their head full of exams and this skill hasn't been going well or whatever it might be, then they have that route available as well. But the route isn't predetermined by me. It's subject to their navigation of it in the session itself.
Yeah. Using that's really helped. A really good example of this would be like finishing in football. You're finishing into a goal, that's our ultimate objective, but how are we going to do that? You could do it via a cross, you could do it via a move shoot, it could be a bit of combination play, and actually just give them an opportunity to say, right, here's maybe, you know, here's the obstacles that you're going to face in these 3 different areas, which one might lend itself more towards a cross, one might do that. Try and navigate your way through and see what different types of finishes you can do. Go. And that might be a really nice way of kind of transferring what you've said there into a specific football environment. And that's just a personal.
I think so. And then you can, pardon my ignorance in football. I mean, I'm a Villa fan, so I don't know much about football. But you can like emphasize some areas within the skill. So, you know, if you're really wanting to focus on heading, for example, I'm trying to transfer how we might do things here into a football context. Is you don't want to rule out the opportunity to finish with your feet or with your knee or whatever it might be, you know, with your left foot, right foot, volley off the deck, whatever it might be, because you don't want to rule out those skills by over focusing or over constraining tasks to guide attention only to heading. But equally, you might want to expose more experience of heading. Therefore, you know, you come up with scoring systems. The goal is a goal, but if it's a headed goal, it might be 2 points versus a goal. You know, little things like that. So you're not ruling in or out the decision-making that is appropriate from the information in the environment, because you probably don't want people putting their head in people's boots 2 inches off the floor too often. You know, that might not be an invitation to head a ball for most people. So finishing with the feet in that context is important. You don't want them ruling out those invitations. So yeah, like scoring systems, games-based approaches I use a lot. And they're underpinned by kind of principles of nonlinear approaches and constraints alongside that, which is, I've made many mistakes doing them. I always call them excellent mistakes because I've brought in information that isn't from the environment and things like this. It's a great journey to go on.
I think that's really interesting. I think the constraints-based approach of some use, Ben Bartlett's particularly good at that over at Fulham and the FA, and I've worked with him and he's fantastic at that. But I think that what you're saying there, actually just providing them with different routes to the challenge, maybe all at one time, allow them to explore, is a really interesting way. Something I'd like to pick up on, and it might link into kind of when you're doing camps, etc., as you mentioned kind of the planning process. So I'd really kind of like to know, what is your kind of plan, do, review, if you like, and how is that affected by a course? So obviously you've mentioned that different areas have different types of courses. What does that look like for athletes? Do you do visualization work? Do they just have clean runs, allow them to explore? Kind of what does that plan, do, review process look like kind of for a camp of these athletes going away?
Yeah, I think it's evolving all the time, this approach, as myself and the athletes go on this journey of understanding, you know, what we perceive the sport to be and our interaction with it. It's got a lot less rigid, I would say, over the years. I'll give you an example, and I'm slightly reluctant to announce it here, but we do have a paper, me and some co-authors, pending on a performance planning approach into the Olympic Games, and yeah, hopeful that, you know, by the time this goes out, maybe it's live, and you can stick it in the show notes. Yeah, there's a blend of sort of open recovery. I guess the level I'm fortunate enough to support, they are highly skilled. And a lot of the pickup, I would call it, when you go to a new venue is about understanding the environment specific context that invites or doesn't invite certain options. So therefore exploration and dwelling within that environment is critical. So we're often seen to, say if we've got 1, 2, 3 weeks into a race, the early phases are about just exploring and attuning to the environment itself and what it offers and what it doesn't offer. So rather than having like coach-led prescribed tasks, which is what the race is, because external individuals set us a course. It's not even that I set them a course. What we'll do is we'll try and cover as much ground as possible, and it's largely athlete-led. And I'm observing seeing what they're curious, what invitations they are picking up on, what they've maybe missed, and then the dialogue around that post is kind of just seeing where we're at and building the experience as we go. As we get closer to racing, we're probably more and more representative. In that we will have more we'll use a planning process from the riverbank more than we might in a more sort of skill adaptability phase, because we don't get a practice in our event. We just get to view others, a select few, often of an inferior quality to the people racing at the race. They're called demo runners basically in our world, paddle course. So I have witnessed a movement towards doing less and less in preparation, though, and trusting sort of more higher order principles. So the purpose of the coursework for us, that tactical planning, as we've moved into this more ecological space, has changed. It's less of a prescription and more about guiding attention to where the key information sources are to self-organize to the tasks during the run. There's a lot of trust there, and that obviously becomes underpinned from training in this way.
Would that be, I'm just trying to analyze that as you're talking, would that be, for example, you're letting them kind of do a run or two and kind of guide their thoughts, you maybe watch the demo runner or demo runs, how many there are, and say, right, gates 7, 10, 11, these are maybe 3 areas for consideration to have from what we've seen from other runners. You maybe come up with a strategy, what it looks like, but these are the 3 main key factors I think we need drawn attention to.
I would say that is done, but from the athlete. So the kind of lead in training and things like that would be very different to what we would call performance training. So we're exploring at the moment, which the paper is on, an adaptation of Fabian Otte, who is in football actually. He's a goalkeeping coach at Borussia Mönchengladbach at the moment. A framework called periodization of skills training. So we're exploring that as an ecological, holistic framework to skill development and how that looks across micro and macro scales. So for a race day there, like the interactions are led by the athlete. So you wouldn't see me coming up. There's decisions and options are here, and here on the course. What I do is I have the capacity to take on more information than them, is where we've got to. Therefore, any of the analysis and things like that is filtered through what the athlete has invited me to interact with, not what I think or impose upon them, if that makes sense. So if an athlete has flagged that they're struggling to get to simplicity of attention on sequence gates 6 to 8, and they feel like there's multiple options available to them and they're not sure which one to have an intention toward, they have invited me to perhaps bring some visual footage available to them. And then the challenge is to put that into their field of perception rather than trying to copy what they've seen. It's like, what does that mean for them? But yeah, largely they take control of the interaction, because I've found that if they don't, or if they're not given the opportunity to, then it's easy to overcomplicate and put too much information into the system from a coaching perspective. I still do it. I did it this morning. I added information into the interaction that wasn't, I don't think in hindsight, needed. And then the athlete was almost worried about whether they needed to reply to what they thought I wanted to hear, rather than focused on how they were going to approach the task. So yeah, I think there's an element of like we talked about at the start, we can overanalyze things and bring too much information into the system. I think we always talk about being willing to go technical and deep and complex, but by the time we're ready to go, the athlete is ready to do their run. We've got it to a level of simplicity that is really quite minimal, and that gives them the headspace, the capacity, the perceptual capacity to engage in the information in the moment, rather than have like second-hand sources of information that are always about evaluation. Am I where I wanted to be? Is a common question. By the time I've considered that, I've missed the opportunity to move there that was in my visual field of attention.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And in terms
probably went a bit deep there. My apologies.
No. I think it does. I think that it's interesting that you kind of you're almost like a resource for them to use in terms of areas that they're struggling with. They come to you and go, "This is what I think or feel. Have you got any additional information you can have to help me make a decision?"
Yeah, exactly that. And if we want to link this to research and theory, so I always say, like, I have knowledge about canoe slalom. I've done it myself as well, but I mean, these guys are way more highly skilled in the doing, the knowledge of the interaction in the moment, which is, I used to place a lot of value on being able to articulate how you did stuff. But I've realized it's probably actually a non-specifying source of information. But so I have a knowledge about that I can offer perspective, but it's not as important as the first person perspective of the person. Therefore, I can complicate things for them too easily. So it's really important for me that they lead the dance of the interaction, and that, I can guide and support it where invited to. And that's obviously a process of iteration over time. We get it wrong all the time. But we've got the strength of relationship where we can communicate what was working for you. I'll often put my hand up and go, "I apologize this morning. I think I interrupted the level of simplicity you'd reached on that move. And I'm wondering if that was from an egotistical perspective for myself." And then and the athlete will say, "Yeah, you did," and give me a mouthful, or they don't, I'm lying. Or they'll say, "Oh, no, I didn't notice it. It didn't have an impact on me." But that allows me to kind of evolve my interactions in the future with them as an invitation.
And then in terms of a review of a run or review of the run that they've just done, what does that look like? And is that very individualized? Does it change from athlete to athlete?
Yeah, it does. And increasingly it's doing so, I would say. So, I mean, traditionally in the sport, if I zoom out of my own interactions quite a lot, so there'll be splits available. So segmenting the run into splits, however detailed you want them. Could be into like 4 sections, 5, or you could be going into every sort of component. And then we'll have video. Like people lean into video hugely. I'd say people are addicted to video in canoeing. Maybe they just like watching themselves paddle. I'm not sure. I mean, increasingly these days, it's so they've got content for social media, right? But we're trying to be less reliant on external sources of information and seeing how that goes for us, so that we almost starve ourselves of them to see how we trust ourselves in the interaction of the doing. And we trust our first. So same for me, like I used to film all the time, or I film with the iPad, and I used to have a little kind of like crutch habit that I'd watch every clip after they'd gone down, just to clarify what I thought or what I thought I'd seen. I realized by the time that's happened, it's further removed from what was actually happening. So try and use less of it these days. But traditionally, the athlete will lead the interaction. So there'll be a hot debrief directly after the run. It's what we call like an emotional download. And that's probably the richest one, because that's where we get closest to maybe where their attention was or something like that. And I'm really kind of, mindful of that. Then we go into the cold debrief, where we're a little bit more, we bring in a bit more objective information, but we're more and more mindful that, as you've said before, that can reduce the task into component parts that maybe isn't reality. So we're somewhere in between, I would say, at the moment. But if we do end up going deep into technical components within a video review, i.e. Jimmy did it like that, let's have a look at Jimmy. He was 0.6 faster across a 3-second split. What we make sure we do better now is it's not a copy and paste solution. It's what does that mean for you? And what does it mean for where your attention is placed? And how simple can you get it back out? So it's about you. So a journey of exploration, I think, Michael, but traditionally video and splits. But again, the athlete is increasingly in charge of what is brought to the table. I will be across all of it because we're really time pressured on race day generally for access to those runs. It's almost like if you imagine doing qualifying in Formula One, but you know the information isn't coming in as quick in real time, and then you got to go again straight away. It's like, so you got to pick and choose. So I tend to get across of it, provide a first filter, then wait for the invitation of what an athlete will want to look at. Because I think there's no rules. Like, I don't think we know that watching video makes you faster on the subsequent passage. So I'm always looking to rupture tradition a little bit and say, what's the purpose of what we're doing here?
Yeah, I had a really interesting one with a guy called Tosh Farrell the other day, who we used to work for Everton, and he said one of the techniques he used to use with the kids when they were learning skills and stuff is to get them to talk through as they're doing it. So what they feel and how they feel as a way of thing. I always imagine the older age groups, whether there is, or particularly in your sport, any value in that in terms of as they're going down, talking through what they feel, what they see, although again, it might change the perception of what they're actually focusing on. You might get a hot take there and then as to why they made the decision that you wouldn't get from the video. They might be like, I just did that, or it might be bump left. So they knew at that moment in time once you put it together. But yeah, it's an interesting principle what he said there for sure. I've got two more questions for you. So the last one is, and I might butcher some names here, so apology if I do.
Go for it.
People like Jacob Kruger and Ricardo Funk, I think that's the name, who obviously...
Oh, yeah. Slight butchering. So you've gone for... this is like a quiz. I like it. I think you've gone for Jakob Kruger there from Slovakia and Ricardo Funk from Germany.
I've gone for ones that I thought I'd be able to pronounce because there's a couple in there I was like, no chance. But what... for people that are kind of that level that have obviously gone on Olympic medals, etc., is there anything that you've seen that really stands out about either the way they work, their preparation, their evaluation, or just them as an athlete?
Yeah, I mean, those are two really exciting examples. I'm always hesitant to talk of others because, as I indicated earlier, unless you dwell within, I don't think you truly understand. And obviously other nations are guarded about what they give away as to who's working on. If I was to give a blanket sort of assumption or stereotypes, I would say that the German system or German approach is pretty structured and pretty. It may be more linear. I'm not sure, but they seem to have a very traditional approach to periodization. So it's capacity into speed and anaerobic and that sort of stuff. So they spend the early parts of the winter in that respect. So it's a more sort of controlled approach. I think the Slovaks, well, the guy in question, so he's like sponsored by Red Bull. He's quite an outgoing, vivacious guy, but the quietest, nice kindly spoken individual. And his English is better than me. But yeah, I think he would probably train in a more variable environments to maybe Ricardo, but again, I'm not too sure. But it's really interesting in our sport, Michael, because the sport itself dictates that variability is inherent and adaptability is inherent, as I would say it is in all sports, but in ours perhaps more than some. The water is the opponent, etc. It can work with you, against you, etc. I think the characteristics those guys do have is they're really adaptable. They're really calm and still through their bodies in the moment, which gives them the capacity to have good attention and see things clearly. And they're very light across the water. Ricardo in particular is exceptional physically in the women's discipline. She's extremely light and extremely powerful, and her transfer of physicality through the water with haptic feel is outstanding. So yeah, you get different systems. It's really interesting, isn't it? Like the Slovaks traditionally, they're all coached by their dad or their, a family member or their husband or wife, and they've kind of had a more sort of family kind of system come through and been extremely successful with that. British have had a more sort of professional system, I guess. These programs feed through to this program, and I think everyone is navigating towards a more program-based professional approach. And I've had a lot of chats with the Slovak team manager who used to work in Scotland as to, it's the danger of pulling the rug from under your own culture to copy another team or approach's culture, isn't it? I think you work with the beauty of our sport is it's situated at the individual environment interaction, and I just love embracing that and everything that goes into that. People's socio-cultural experiences, psychological experiences, the facilities they have access to will determine. The Germans, perhaps they train in that more traditional way because they don't have a white water course for half the winter because it's frozen or not available. So they only have access to flat water. So that's their invitation to train in that way. Whereas we have this beautiful course behind me that pumps all year round. So we struggle to turn down the opportunity to go and play on the bubbles.
Now, I think people at times undersell the importance of a culture or what that country breeds. I look at Fiji rugby team, for example. I don't think you'll get them to be very, very structured teams similar to the way we are, but it's because they love the excitement, they love handoffs, and that's why they're the best at sevens, because of the way they play and the way they culturally fit. And I think that at times, although the imitation is good intentioned, I think you take away actually what the culture of that country or that individual's grown up into, how that's actually facilitated their development and why maybe they suit that particular system rather than can't just pick up and copy and paste, as you said.
Yeah. And your words there remind me very closely if people are curious about research. So Marco Sullivan and Jimmy Vaughan and others over at AIK Stockholm in a football context have done some great and are doing some great ethnographic studies around the influence of culture and socio-cultural factors within coaching academies right through the age groups that you work at yourself and into elite senior football as well.
Perfect. And last question for me, and it could be difficult, so apologies. Who is I'll phrase this differently. Who's the most influential coach or person you've worked with and why?
Great question. I think if my instinct answer is a number of athletes. Fortunate enough to work with two people for over 10 years, and the influence of them on my own practice as we journeyed together, like we grew as coach and athlete together, I think, through some interesting experiences for them through adulthood. In terms of athletes, there's Mallory Franklin and Kimberley Woods, and another one I work with at the moment, Adam, would be very similar, Adam Burgess, in terms of a shorter term. But coaching-wise, I think some of the influences, the really rich influences, not to say there aren't any within canoeing, have been the people who tripped me up with no baggage from canoe slalom world. So Russell Earnshaw, who works across rugby and multi-sport, is a former rugby player himself. People in the more educational space like Richard Cheetham, MBE. People who've come into my environment and kind of ask, why do you do that? Because they have no pre-context that it's normal to do that. And they really kind of ruptured my practice and given me the invitation then to do what I want with it. It's not been prescriptional or dictatorial. It's like, I've noticed this. Would you like to unpack that? So those guys in particular, and many, many, many more along the route, I would say. An influence on me within slalom, I think, would be a guy called Mark Delaney, who doesn't work with the British team at the moment, but successful Olympic coach and Olympic athlete himself. And the more I grow into a more ecological space, the simplicity with which he managed to get to in viewing canoe slalom was really exciting for me to be able to kind of further understand. I wasn't ready for it in my early years, but I think you really have to know a sport to get it to a simple level, don't you? And yeah, he was the epitome of both there.
Perfect. Listen, really appreciate your time. A fascinating conversation, which I think has provided a lot of content for people to go away with. So yeah, really appreciate your time, and hopefully we can catch up again with you soon.
Thank you, Michael. All the best.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast. and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.